Finally getting to the end of her tether, Spelda pulled a naming knife, from her belt. The knife was so important. It had been made especially for her son, as knives were made for all the wood troll children. They were essential for the naming ritual, and when the youngsters came of age, each one was given his or her individual naming knife to keep. Spelda gripped the handle tightly, reached forwards, and, as the procedure demanded, hacked off a piece of wood from the nearest tree. It was this little bit of deep wood which would reveal her child's name. Spelda worked quickly. She knew only too well that the sound of chopping would attract inquisitive, possibly deadly, attention. When she was done, she tucked the wood under her arm, trotted back through the woods, untied herself from the anchor tree, and returned to the cabin. There, she kissed the piece of wood twice and threw it into the fire. "With your brothers and sisters, the names came at once," Spelda explained. "Snodpill, Henchweed, Poosniff, as clear as you like. But with you, the wood did nothing but crackle and hiss. The Deepwoods had refused to name you." "And yet, I have a name," said Twig. "Indeed you have," Spelda said. "Thanks to Hare." Twig nodded. He remembered the occasion so well. Hare had just returned to the village after a long spell away. Twig remembered how overjoyed the wood trolls had all been to have the oak elf back among them. For Hare, who was well versed in the finger points of wood lore, was their advisor, their counselor, their oracle. It was to him that the wood trolls came with their worries. "There was already quite a gathering beneath his ancient lullaby tree when we arrived," Spelda was saying. "Hare was sitting in his empty caterbird cocoon, holding forth about where he had been and what he had seen on his travels. The moment he saw me, however, his eyes opened wide and his ears rotated. "Whatever's up?" he asked. And I told him everything. "Oh, for goodness sake, pull yourself together," he said. Then he pointed to you. "Tell me," he said. "What is that round the little one's neck?" "That's his comfort cloth," I said. "He won't let anyone touch it. And he won't be parted from it neither. His father tried once, and the boy was too old for such childish things. But he just curled up into a ball and cried until we gave it back to him." Twig knew what was coming next. He had heard it so many times before. Then Hare said, "Give it to me," and stared into your eyes with those big black eyes of his. All oak elves have eyes like that. They can see those parts of the world that remain hidden to others. "And I gave him my comfort cloth," whispered Twig. Even now, he didn't like anyone touching it, and kept it tightly knotted around his neck. "That you did," continued Spelda. "And I can scarce believe it to this day. But that wasn't all, oh no." "Oh no?" echoed Twig. "He took your cloth and sort of stroked it, all gentle like it as if it was a living thing. And then he traced the pattern on it with his fingertip ever so lightly. 'A lullaby tree,' he said at last. And I saw that he was right. I'd always thought it was just a pretty pattern, all those squiggles and little stitches. But no. It was a lullaby tree, all right. Plain as the nose on your face." Twig laughed. "And the strange thing is, you didn't mind old Hare touching your cloth. You just sat there, all serious and silent. Then he gave you that stare of his again, and said in a soft voice, 'You're part of the deep woods, Silent One. The naming ritual has not worked, but you are a part of the deep woods.' A part of the deep woods," he repeated, his eyes glazing over. Then he raised his head and spread his wide arms. "His name shall be Twig!" Twig exclaimed, unable to keep silent a longer moment. "That's right," said Spelda, laughing. "Out you came with it, just like that. Twig. The first word you ever spoke. And then Hare said, 'You must look after him well, for the boy is special.' Not different, but special. It was the fact that had kept him going when the other wood troll children had picked on him so mercilessly. Not a single day had passed without some incident or other. But the worst time of all was when he'd been set upon during the fateful Trockbladder match. Before then, Twig had loved the game. Not that he was very good at it, but he had always enjoyed the excitement of the chase, for Trockbladder was a game that involved a great deal of running about it. It was played at a large square of land between the back of the village and the forest. The pitch was crisscrossed with well-worn paths beaten out by generations of young wood trolls. Between these bear tracks, the grass grew thick and tall. The rules of the game were simple. There were 2 teams, with as many wood trolls on each side as wanted to play. The aim was to catch the Trockbladder, the bladder of the Hammelhorn stuffed with dried trock beans, and run 12 paces, calling out the numbers as you went. If you managed that, you were allowed a shot at the central basket, which could double your score. However, since the ground was often slippery, the Trockbladder always squidgy, and the entire opposing team was trying to wrest the ball away, this was not as easy as it sounded. In his 8 years of playing the game, Twig had never once managed to score a Trockbladder. On this particular morning, no one was having much of luck. Heavy rain had left the pitch waterlogged, and the game kept stopping and starting as, time after time, wood troll after wood troll came sliding off the muddy paths. It wasn't until the 3rd quarter that the Trockbladder landed near enough to Twig for him to seize it and start running. 1, 2, 3! He yelled out as, with the Trockbladder wedged beneath the elbow of his left arm, he belted along the paths which led to the center of the pitch. The nearer to the basket you were when you reached 12, the easier it was to score. 4, 5... In front of him, half a dozen members of the opposing team were converging on him. He darted down the path to the left. His opponents chased after him. 6, 7, to me! Twig, to me! Various members of his own team called out, "Pass it!" But Twig didn't pass it. He wanted to score. He wanted to hear his teammates' cheers, to feel their hands slapping him on the back. For once, he wanted to be the hero. 8, 9... He was completely surrounded. "Pass it to me!" he heard. It was Hottergruff calling from the far side of the pitch. Twig knew that if he chucked the ball to him now, his friend would have a good chance of scoring for the team. But that was no good. You remembered who scored, not who set up the goal. Twig wanted everyone to remember that he had scored. He paused. Half of the opposing team were almost upon him. He couldn't go forwards. He couldn't go back. He looked round at the basket, so near, and yet so far, and he had wanted that goal. He wanted it more than anything. All at once, a little voice in his head seemed to say, "But what's the problem? The rules say nothing about sticking to the path." Twig looked back towards the basket and swallowed nervously. The next instant he did what no wood troll before had ever done. He left the path. The long grass whipped at his base legs as he loped towards the basket. 10, 11, 12! He screamed and dunked the bladder down through the basket. "A Trockbladder!" he cried, and looked round happily. "A 24-pointer! I've scored a tro—" He stopped. The wood trolls on both teams were glaring at him. There were no cheers, no slaps on the back. "You stepped from the path!" one of them shouted. "No one steps from the path!" cried another. But... Twig stammered. "There's nothing in the rules that says But the other wood trolls were not listening. They knew, of course, that the rules didn't mention keeping to the paths, but why should they? In Trockbladder, as in their lives, the wood trolls never strayed from the paths. It was a given. It was taken as read. It would have made as much sense to have a rule telling them not to stop breathing. All at once, as if by some prearranged signal, the wood trolls fell on Twig. "You lanky weirdo!" they cried, as they kicked him and punched him. "You hideous, gangly freak!" Suddenly, a fiery pain tore through Twig's arms. It felt as if it had been branded. He looked up to see a wad of his smooth flesh being viciously twisted by a handful of hard spatula fingers. "Hottergruff," Twig whispered. The Snatchwoods and the Gropknots were neighbors. He and Hottergruff had been born within a week of each other and grew up together. Twig had thought they were friends. Hottergruff sneered and twisted the skin round still further. Twig bit into his lower lip and fought back the tears, not because of the pain in his arm that he could bear, but because Hottergruff had now also turned against him. As Twig stumbled home, battered, bruised, and bleeding, it was the fact that he'd lost his only friend that hurt most. Now, because he was different, he was also alone.